Okay, so I assigned a whole series of videos for you to watch. I wouldn't want to make you buy a gigantic pile of books. If you're interested in following up on these thinkers, you can pick up Homo Soccer by Giorgio Agamben, or Giorgio Agamben in Italian, and perhaps Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World by René Girard, Frenchman who made most of his career here in North America, in the United States, at Johns Hopkins, I think at Stanford for a bit, if I'm not mistaken. And The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, we'd say in English, right? I assign these things because they're highly worthwhile. We didn't have time to plow our way through those texts, and so you got videos instead. And I hope those stimulated you. And what I'd like to do today is kind of link these things together in a way so as to arrive at a kind of working knowledge of human nature. We've already done some of that, of course, with Aquinas's theory of the emotions, of which most of you were actually all of you were very appreciative. And Hegel's theory of desire, obviously that relates to the theory of the emotions, right? Because every emotion seems to contain or be accompanied at least by desire. I say contain, or function as a kind of specification in some way of desire. So you can read those two theories in an integrated fashion. That would be a kind of project you could pursue. Maybe I'll make one of you into a philosophy major. You'll go on and get a PhD, and then 10 years from now, I'm going to see a book on in the library with your name on it that says Aquinas and Hegel, the theory of emotion, something of that sort. So let's go ahead and dive into this. Today we'll pursue a general understanding of human nature. Let me make the slideshow, make this like this. There you go. Today we'll pursue a general understanding of human nature by means of which one can grasp situations and rather than respond to them in ineffective ways or ways that increase harm and disorder, introduce an effective correction. And this will have obvious applications whether one is a manager or worker, member of a family, or occupies any position whatsoever within human society. Okay, so what I was trying to say before is that we're going to try to situate the ethical theories we've studied in a general conception of human nature. We started with that, obviously with Aquinas and Hegel, and we're going to continue that today. We'll do a little review of Hegel and then move that forward. So human beings are endowed with animal bodies, and this causes them to be centered on their own sensations, right? Your sensations are your sensations, my sensations are my sensations. I might demand something of you, like to do a certain assignment. I'm not conscious of how tired you are or what you went through at work, right? Or the bills that you have to pay or whatever it may be. And you're not conscious of my sensations, of how fatigued I've been and the bills I have to pay, so on and so forth. One thing we can reasonably infer is that actually everyone's probably relatively fatigued and we all have bills to pay, right? That's by analogy, we can infer that these things are likely true of all of the adult members of this group. And if you're young, you're 17, 18, 19, there's a chance that you're being taken care of, but your parents have to deal with all that, right? You're probably tired too, to be perfectly frank, particularly by this point in the semester. Okay. So besides being endowed with animal bodies and our own sensations, we're also moral, spiritual, and social animals that by nature take into consideration the needs of others. We voluntarily take on unpleasant tasks for the sake of others and for the sake of the group of which we are members. Okay? We call that communitarianism. When you do it for someone else, it's altruism. When you do it for the group of which you're a member, that's communitarianism, right? Okay, and those two aren't necessarily exclusive. We'd have to analyze that carefully. This normally leads to a greater benefit for the individual, right? When you act in altruistic and communitarian ways. There is an intransitive effect, which we explored earlier in the semester, namely the growth in virtue, where we can add satisfaction, meaning, and deepen bonds of solidarity with one's fellow workers, right? However, the tendency towards egoism, the placing of individual interests above those of others or the group, is rooted in human nature itself, as we know very well, and we've seen through study. Persons who act egotistically, right, are those who place the passions above reason. The most important and general of these passions is, of course, as we have seen, desire. So if we can just kind of nail down desire, and we kind of put a lot of time into that already, then we get a starting point for working out a general philosophy of the emotions. See that? Now you can turn back to Aquinas' work on that. That's your PhD assignment. So let's get back to egoistic absorption. This is why Hegel calls self-consciousness desire in general. It is the most general and basic way that human beings become aware of themselves in relation to the surrounding world. I'm going to put Hegel's theory here. This is my recapitulation of his theory in much more accessible and kind of common sense terms. That's my hope. Everyone is familiar with someone who is controlled by his or her feelings. You bet. Such a person is dominated by fears, annoyances, resentments, and desires. The prioritization of the passions, desire in particular, has the following features. First, a person subject to this prioritization of the passions straight away takes his or her aims from his or her passions, not from reason. This can be done without reflection at all, but is normally accompanied by rationalization. What's rationalization? That's finding any justification, however flimsy, to make the action appear defensible before others, right? And psychologists have found that well more than 80% of the time people are engaged in justification. That's because most persons haven't put enough time into working on moral virtue. So second, and that fact, by the way, that datum from the science of psychology will support what I'm going to say later, okay? Second, a person dominated by desire always assigns to himself or herself an amplified, unjustifiable right to satisfy that desire. A normative self-assertion that places him or her ahead of others. We have called this tendency egoism. You can call it the tendency to cut the line. Third, that person always assigns the object of his desire, or aversion, of course, an exaggerated importance. That is, he inflates its value. It's like in the film Shopaholic, when that woman, whenever she would see a pair of boots that could possibly satisfy her impulse to buy, suddenly it became all important, all absorbing. The absolute good. She had to have the boots or she would die, of course, right? So we have called this tendency absorption with the object desired. Hence, a person dominated by desire, the passions generally, exhibits egoistic absorption. And now think of examples of persons you know who exhibit the two-sided trait. And a few of you have mentioned a couple of examples in your journals. So, desire and recognition. When two persons characterized by egoistic absorption desire the same object, they come into conflict and a struggle ensues. Hegel imagines a scenario in which two people enter into a fight to the death. But you can imagine two persons merely fighting with words, of course, because we want to generalize these theories to everyday situations. We're not continuously getting into fights to the death, but we very often enter into conflict with persons, practically daily, right? So when two persons struggle with one another, the process induces a reflection on one's own rights claim, okay? That is why each person is defending his claim. Neither will simply withdraw, but each continues to assert his right, even his sovereignty over the object. And I deliberately introduced that word sovereignty now in order for you to begin somewhere in the side of your consciousness to think about the connection between Hegel and Agamben, which we're going to get to. In a word, each combatant, in response to being challenged, demands not merely the object, but more fundamentally and importantly, that the other combatant recognize his right and sovereignty relative to that object. So we're familiar with the desire and the demand for recognition. Now, in everyday life, repeated clashes inducing reflection on one's implicit rights claims leads to reflection that normally, right, induces moral growth, right? As you have these conflicts as you get older, and you're continuously challenged and really compelled by situations to think about more or less where you stand in society, what you can legitimately demand from other people and what they can legitimately demand from you. Most people make some kind of progress over time, and that's what we call moral growth. They, in some kind of uncertain way, they work their way towards a kind of defensible set of opinions and principles concerning how they fit in and what just moral conduct actually consists in. So, considered abstractly, right, these repeated clashes can lead either to mutual recognition, right, and compromise, or else to a hierarchical relationship in which one person is dominant. At the extreme, as Hegel points out, it leads to a master with absolute sovereignty lording over a slave with zero status, having no rights, not even to his own body. That's what it is to be a slave. So now we're going to move on to, we'll try to connect this again. I connected it briefly in a previous lecture, but I want to make this systematic and thorough. Connect this again to Girard, who you've now studied at least through a 10-minute video. This is not nothing, right? So now egoism as such generates an amplified normative assertion, right? Asserting a right you really don't have. Egoism generates an amplified normative assertion in relation to every object that the agent can conceivably take an interest in. Now there enters a fascinating psychological mechanism discovered by René Girard. It is that the individual's desire reflexively, like when the doctor hits your knee and you kick out, reflexively activates in response to the desire of another, whether what one represents as the other's desire is true, or even if you merely imagine another person desiring something, right? Like the shopaholic thing is pretty good. I think there's a scene there where she imagines another woman wants an object and that instantly ignites her desire, right? Even having a false opinion about someone else's desire is sufficient. So it is not at all necessary that two individuals just happen to desire the same object in order for conflict to ensue, right? On the contrary, it is sufficient that one agent desire an object. That's all you need. Or even merely seem to desire that object. If a second agent becomes aware of this, that individual will desire that object as well, and that can lead him to contest the first agent's right to that object. Okay? This is mimetic desire. I claim this follows deductively from Hegel's theory. I mean, you can wrestle with my claim. That's my claim. You can, if you don't think it works, send me an email and explain to me how I messed up, or put it in your journal. So this occurs because in holding that this occurs because in holding that another desires an object, one experiences a challenge to one's own assertion of sovereignty, a challenge that mechanically produces a response. The first flicker of this response is a desire for the same object. Now, I'm the first person to acknowledge there are specimens of high moral virtue out there who don't respond this way, okay? But I already cited the datum from the science of psychology that the vast majority of persons engage in rationalization of their egoistic impulses, okay? So all those people engage in this kind of mimetic desire, mimetic conflict. Probably includes me, guys, okay? So all desire is mimetic. Persons who are sufficiently morally developed know how to acknowledge one another's socially recognized right without overt conflict. Those are always things, always things occurring in one's imagination and things of that sort, one's passions. But that's why in the Christian tradition, right, there's this tradition of repenting for all of the sins, the offenses, and the negligences of which one is, the continuous flow of junk through one's consciousness that must be regarded with by God with unappeasable distaste, to use the words of C.S. Lewis, right? So let's see here. But with monotonous regularity, socially developed persons do enter into conflict. And the point is that in a society populated by persons who are neither perfectly altruistic nor perfect saints, as a matter of fact, they're rationalizers, right? They rationalize their actions. The possibility of mimetic conflict is not merely embedded in every encounter, but assured of regular actualization. So think of all the conflicts you've been witness to in your life. Girard goes further and in fact, and asserts that all human desire is mimetic. So it's not merely that this or that particular desire is mimetic, but all. So this actually goes beyond Hegel. So Hegel would maintain that you take an isolated human being and drop him in the woods, and if somehow he could survive to adulthood, he would desire things without that being mimetic desire. But Girard is offering us effectively a kind of social theory of human desire. He's not considering what a human being would look like if he were dropped in the woods and somehow survived. I think Girard would say that would scarcely even be a human being. What he's concerned with is socialized human beings, okay? So he asserts that everything a person desires is desired on account of imitating another person's real or imagined desire. Okay, does that hold up? Let's see. Now, as I say that he's right. This is the correct inference, right? And it's the correct inference because we're presupposing the context of human society. So we're not doing the Hegelian thought experiments at this point. We're presupposing human society, right? So obviously we're not mere animals. We do not merely preserve our bodies as a mere animal does, but aim at establishing our right over things and even persons. Now, some of you are thinking wolf packs, they have a hierarchy. These are interesting comparisons to make, and I read actually articles and papers about making these comparisons. I'm not going to pursue that right now, but I want to acknowledge, if you're having that thought, I want to acknowledge it. So as this is an essential activity of human self-consciousness, right, asserting one's right over things, it necessarily follows that we take an interest in whatever others desire and how they're cognitively, cognitive means with respect to desire, they're cognitively motivated acquisitive activities bear on our own spontaneous rights claims. It's unavoidable, right? Now, Madison Avenue, that's where the people who populate the advertising firms are, right? Madison Avenue executives understand this extremely well. Okay. So a difficulty with suggestion is that it would seem that socialized persons are by definition persons who do not reflexively take themselves to have an unlimited right over each thing they encounter, right? Here is where the human soul becomes subtle. Very few human beings live lives of unconditional altruism or sanctity. There's a subtle distinction between those two. I don't have to get into it. Mother Teresa, Padre Pio, Saint Therese, these are very, very rare persons. And we all acknowledge that, right? Well, all normal members of society are willing to help one another. In fact, both respect and concern for others are nearly always conditional and negotiated, right? Right? I mean, how many people do you know who live out a kind of absolute respect and concern for others? Like my Aunt Ray seemed to have been like that. So I can pick an example from my own circle. She's been deceased now for at least 30 years. Okay, so one will respect another's right, but she's a very rare sort of person. One will respect another's right unless doing so touches upon one's vital interests, right? That's normally how it goes. Or be concerned for another so long as it does not require too much inconvenience, where people have limits. You can call that sort of limited altruism. I'll help you out. I'll help you out up to a point, right? Beyond that point, I'm not going. So this means, and that's actually reasonable. You're willing to sell your house or sell your car in order to, take the money and hand it out to a bunch of homeless guys? You might say, well, that would be a waste of time anyway because they're going to use it on drugs. Okay, are you willing to sell your house and or sell your car and give the proceeds to a manual house, right? Where they will guarantee that it will go towards housing and feeding people. I think not. You're not going to do it, right? Neither would I. But I think it's a good thing to give a portion of one's earnings to that effect. And you can say, well, hold on, Dr. Chicky here. That's the rational thing to do. Because if I give a portion of my earnings to charity, right, then that means I can stay in business and I can continue giving to charity indefinitely into the future. If I give it all away in one shot, that'll be the last time I give away anything to anyone, because I'll have to check into a manual house myself, right? But if I stay employed, I can continue. I can give $50 1 week, $50 in a couple of weeks, so on and so forth. Keep that going indefinitely into the future. It's all going to add up to a much larger sum over time. Okay, well, that's an argument. So this means that people are continuously negotiating the levels of respect and concern, or their negative counterparts, with which they relate to others. Again, that's obvious, right? So therefore, apart from saints, the representation of another's desire is always the occasion for the activation of an agent's own desire, and the other person always, therefore, becomes an obstacle, which is a big part of Girard's theory. The only question is how to react in the particular case. Do you react with a direct challenge? Do you react with subterfuge by acquiring a surrogate object? Your neighbor buys a car, and rather than directly challenge him for his car, which very rarely ever happens, so there are car thefts and there are high carjackings, you buy a car of the same model or something comparable. Or maybe you can't quite compete with him because he makes more money than you do, but you buy a car, right? You get some partial satisfaction. Or do you collapse inwardly? Or go insane? I mean, there are people who go insane thanks to mimetic desire. That's a big part of Girard's theory. Again, look at things hidden since the foundation of the world. That's the complete presentation of the theory there. His introduction is in Violence of the Sacred. It's a great book, but I would say just go straight to things hidden since the foundation of the world. He also did one, I think he has a book just called Mimetic Desire, but that's just pure literary theory. That's a good book too. But the relation would always generate violence, but for the presence of two mitigating factors. Okay, so mimetic desire, okay, will produce mimetic violence, but for one of two deeply embedded conditions. I say deeply embedded in the very structure of society. It'll take me a couple of slides to explain this. So, please, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, that's just perfectly understandable because I haven't explained it yet. So just be patient. As no, I'm about to explain this. Okay, so the first is the scapegoat. So we'll have to dwell on that. And Bishop Barrett explained that pretty well, but we'll go over it again. And the second is a model of perfect altruism or sanctity, the imitation of which in and of itself diffuses violence. That's a possibility too. And in and of itself fosters mutual goodwill. Now we saw this second possibility in connection with the people of Chambon-sur-Lignon, right? Who saved the Jewish children even though they were risking their necks and their own children's lives when they did it. Why would a bunch of people, like 500 families, do that? Because they had a second model. They had the model of self-giving love, which diffuses violence and fosters unlimited goodwill, even unlimited altruism. And you say, well, come on. Yeah, an entire town did it. So that means if it's possible for them, folks, it's possible for us. You follow me? There's nothing special about those people. They just happen to have a fired up preacher. Okay, so we'll who really managed to persuade them morally and spiritually. All right. So the logic, let's get into the scapegoat. The logic of mimetic desire generates not merely a conflict between two parties, but an ever more encompassing circumference of violence that threatens to unravel and destroy any possible human society. Okay? So I want you to pay attention to that. Here's an important thesis. So important, I put it in italics. Mimesis is necessarily expansive, for even the act of violence itself becomes an object of mimetic desire. Okay? Get that? So you see one person acting violently, and one spontaneously assumes a right to do the very same thing. But as human societies obviously exist, there must also exist some other mechanism whereby the general spread of violence may be checked or redirected. Otherwise, all human societies would spontaneously combust, right, from violence, because one act would then lead to another act of imitated violence to another one, and so on and so forth, and the whole thing would unravel. So how is all this brought to an end so the whole thing doesn't just explode, burn down? So the most historically common human solution to the problem of the spread of violence, spread like a contagion over a whole society, is for all members of that society, minus one, to unite and kill that single excluded member who has been excluded, accused, and found guilty without any formal process very often, found guilty of causing the loss of social cohesion. And that person is accused of being the source of the contagion. In the literature, ancient literature, it's literally thought of as a contagion. The spread of violence is thought of as a contagion. This individual is the scapegoat. The members of a society overcome mutual hatred for one another, enmity, by uniting in that enmity against one person. Notice this, they do not overcome enmity itself, but concentrate it and direct it destructively towards a common object. And through the murder of the scapegoat, every member of society is simultaneously satisfied and unified. I should have written there. Okay? They're now bound in a kind of negative, murderous solidarity. Now I know this is kind of dark. It doesn't sound, like happy day, right? But not everything about human beings is good, and there's a lot that's bad. Now, if you want a general comprehension of human nature, you have to look at the dark side, and you have to look at the good side as well. I already mentioned some of the good stuff, right? You have to look at the kingdom of darkness, and you have to look at the kingdom of lights, right? The two of which have no admixture or in eternal antagonism with one another. Okay, many of you take that literally, and you can take it metaphorically, okay, if you like. So it is the act whereby the members of a society enter that act of murdering the scapegoat, is the act whereby the members of a society enter into mutual recognition of one another as more or less equal objects of respect and concern, as defined in opposition to the anathema, the scapegoat. This even works in high school, right, or grade school. You know, they pick on one kid, and everyone else is more or less at peace. But you know, there's a lot of fighting going on there too. But as we have seen, without perfect altruism, new flare-ups of mimetic desire are inevitable. So even in that society, right, flare-ups will occur. But the whole thing, it didn't flare up into an inferno, burn the whole thing down. Okay, they put out the fire, and of course, local fires can flare up here or there, and it is possible the whole thing will burn down later. So, in fact, Girard's study of the anthropological data, because his research is based on actual study of anthropology, this shows that the scapegoat mechanism is universal. You can find evidence of it in every continent, amongst every people. Okay? The profound success of scapegoating in securing civil peace always motivated groups to replicate the act. This is the origin of the religious rite of sacrifice. And originally, human beings sacrificed human beings. And this reached a kind of peak of demonic excess with the Aztecs. Okay, it existed in antiquity. You can find it referenced in the Bible with the ancient Canaanites who would sacrifice their children to Moloch. They had a big bronze statue apparently, and they would heat it up. And unfortunately, they would take a newborn baby, or a baby at least, and put it in the arms of the heated up bronze, and they would obviously die horribly, right? And it's also recorded in the event of God commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and then God stops him. The point of that passage, everyone agrees, is that two things. Number one, God saying, I have every right that Moloch has and every other God has. I have every right. I can command you to do this, but I'm not going to. That's what distinguishes me from these other guys. I do not demand human sacrifice. Okay? And Christians then take that. That's how everybody who reads that passage, Jews, Christians, I believe Muslims, will agree on that reading. And Christians then say that not only would God not demand human sacrifice, he's willing to sacrifice himself, right? Because the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are the same, right? Christian theology. So for the Father to send the Son is in a way for him to send, it's for God to send God, right? To undergo the sacrifice. I'll do it for you, right? Okay, so anyways, let's see here. So all human societies, except that of the ancient Israelites and Christian societies, are based on and depend for their unity and existence on the murder of a scapegoat, arbitrarily assigned blame for all of that society's evil fortune. You know, there's just the bare possibility that they get the right guy, but that's typically not the case. You know, the vast majority of cases, you know, the person is definitely not the cause of widespread social disorder. And unfortunately, historically, we see they very often take people at the fringes of society, some old lady, you know, living at the margins of the village who's accused of witchcraft or something of that sort. I think we're all familiar with that sort of idea. So in sum, self-consciousness is desire, which immediately assumes the form of a desire to dominate. This in Latin is libido dominandi. That's just the desire to dominate. This leads to conflict animated by a desire for recognition, which generates mimetic desire. This threatens to engulf and destroy the whole of society. This tendency is checked through the murder of the scapegoat, through which social cohesion is purchased, even solidarity, right? This original murder is then taken as the model for the periodic sacrificial killing of the victim for the sake of the social whole. And historically, this took the form of human sacrifice, but eventually we know evolved into animal sacrifice. So this accomplishment is fragile insofar as the cohesion of society is contingent upon the fading, I emphasize fading, satisfaction of the social whole relative to the most recent sacrifice. Call this the fading principle. Actual conflicts over external goods in a zero-sum situation. That means there has to be one winner and one loser. Well, at most one winner and everyone else is a loser. So actual conflicts over external goods in a zero-sum situation offer repeated opportunities for the renewal of competition and overt violence. Now, in the first part of the course, we learned that the temptation to elevate external goods, power, money, and status, over internal goods, truth, wisdom, virtue, and holiness, exists wherever there are human beings. As far as pleasure, the pleasure occurs in the soul and in the body, or in the soul and the body at once. But the pleasures of the body are certainly fleeting, and they're rather coarse in comparison with the higher pleasures of the soul. And persons can elevate those also over internal goods. So this kind of elevating external goods over internal goods, this is temptation as such, right? That is what you're tempted to do, and will elevate one of those lower goods over one of the higher goods. So we now see inversion is actually grounded in a deeper principle. Inversion is grounded in the desire to dominate. That is an expression of the will to sovereignty. Okay? Think will to power, if you like. It's rooted in the will to sovereignty at the basis of self-consciousness as such. Otherwise put, the origin of evil is self-will and pride. It's an old lesson. So the will to confirm one's sovereignty drives toward the total domination of material and social reality. And this is why billionaires are never satisfied with what they have, but always seek more. There's a technical word for this, financialization. That has a more precise meaning, but I'll use it for that in that way at this particular moment for our purposes. Okay, I mean, you've noticed that how billionaires have so much money they can't even use all of it, right? Yet they want more. It's like having a gigantic hill of jelly beans you'll never finish, but you're not done. You want to get more jelly beans, right? I mean, why get more money when you can't even use all the money you have? You can literally get into a plane, stay up there, and stuff your face full of caviar for the next 70 years, while being kept alive with the most expensive medical equipment you can buy. You're worth billions of dollars. So have a fleet of boats following you wherever you go, so on and so forth. You following? Okay. So, but they need more for some reason. That's a psychological pathology, guys. Okay. And further, this is why many are never satisfied with even an extreme degree of technical control, but seek total domination of the cosmos. Technology. Okay. Endless money, endless power. So let's talk about this in terms of history, because we are historical beings. We are living within a certain tradition, a very complex tradition, unmanageably complex at this point. And you've learned a lot about that tradition in this course. I mean, if you know the history of Western ethics, you know a good deal. Not everything you need to know, but you know a good deal about Western civilization once you know those ethical doctrines. I mean, you can talk conversantly about Plato and Stoicism and St. Augustine and Aquinas, and then Hobbes and Kant and Mill and Hegel and Nietzsche, and now all this psychological stuff I'm doing here. You're in a pretty good position, okay? And then now you take a general history of literature, if it's competent, and a good take it Western Civ 1 and Western Civ 2 at CCRI or elsewhere, and start making connections, start putting these things together. You'll get a picture of how it all holds together, okay? So let's talk about some of the history. So the Christian interregnum that we call the Middle Ages integrated the rejection of scapegoating, or at least a pathological scapegoating. We'll get to that. Human and animal sacrifice into its very foundation. Okay, so the key here for understanding the medieval period, and then of course there's a division when the Eastern Orthodox Church breaks off, and then another division when the Protestant Church is split from the Catholic Church. But that's all Christianity, okay? We'll just understand all of those variants of Christianity as centered on the example of Christ, the God who sacrifices himself for his creatures. So, of course, the key is the person and model of Jesus Christ, choosing not to join others in murdering a scapegoat, but rather voluntarily assuming the role of the scapegoat himself, so as to call others into a beloved community of which he is the founder and head, his church. This is the society that forms its members towards moral and spiritual perfection on his model, of course. So this society necessarily contains morally imperfect specimens. I mean, the society exists in order to perfect the imperfect. So these of necessity will behave immorally, right? Even gravely so, inevitably, right? And it is a curious feature of Catholic theology. The injustice of some is used by God to occasion the sanctification of the others through the cultivation of patience and certain generosity of spirit that motivates them to pray for the very persons who are persecuting them. The model there is Christ praying for his murderers on the cross, on the basis of the effective dogma of all Christian churches that God wills that all persons be saved. Okay, so persons who follow Calvin actually reject that, or at least some persons who follow Calvin actually reject that, maintain that there's what they call a prelapsarian predestination of some souls for damnation. Okay, so in the medieval system, human sacrifice is annulled. In its place, God permits the sacrifice of his utterly innocent son, right? God the Father of God the Son. This innocence perfectly reveals the brutality and injustice of the scapegoating mechanism, right? It's emphasize that. You want to understand history, you want to understand your civilization. You don't have to practice Christianity to understand some of this, right? And you need to understand this. You want to understand basically the history of the West, and therefore world history, and yourself ultimately, because you're a creature of that history. So it's this innocence that's so important. It's not only asserted, right, by the tradition, it's stated by Pontius Pilate. He's innocent. I find no fault in him, right? That has a mystical significance, those words. This innocence perfectly reveals the brutality and injustice of the scapegoating mechanism, and so it functions to repel our species from it, at least those who are receptive to the lesson embedded in the crucifixion. And there's a lot there. I can't get any further into that. This sets the model for overcoming pathological scapegoating. Each is to take on the burden of the entire community in an act of selfless love. So sometimes you find people who are staunch defenders of the West in opposition to those who think the West is basically a sort of evil cooperative endeavor that has attempted to smash down every other civilization, whether in the Americas, Africa, Asia, so on and so forth. And yes, Western nations have done a lot of bad things, no doubt about that. But the persons defending it, they defend this as the one thing needful for human beings, and the one great lesson which you're not going to find anyplace else. You can disagree, but that's what they maintain. This model of Christ-like, selfless, sacrificial love, and all the virtues that it entails. Not to mention the peace and joy that one enjoys for oneself. Okay, so this call to the heroic assumption of responsibility entered into Western conceptions of kingship, and today even of leadership, and it makes at least three demands. Okay, so first, one must face the reality about oneself, namely the imperfections, the distortions, flaws, and ultimately the moral ugliness in one's own nature, because everyone has it. In short, one's own will to dominate, one has to face this, one's own will to dominate, and all of the internal effects that this has on one's character, okay? Then one must respond in three ways: repent for one's voluntary contribution to one's defects, and the degree to which one has not combated them, make a firm effort not to prolong expressing these moral vices, and finally make a sincere effort to repair for the damage one has done. How many Hollywood films have come out about some deadbeat dad who left his kids and showed up 20 years later and tried to repair the damage, right? So second, one must forgive others for their own faults, heroically take upon oneself the responsibility to model virtue and even repair the damage done by others, and draw others through love into a beloved community. Now, some of you are saying this is unjust. It's about love. It's not about justice, right? It's about heroic self-giving. That's the model. Third, one must actively seek to discover the truth in general, communicate it, and defend it against all enemies, thus increasing the sovereignty of truth over human affairs. Now, when you do that, two things are going to happen to you. You're finding this attractive. You want to do this. You're going to attract people because people admire individuals who state the truth, and you're going to make a lot of enemies. Okay, and so you're going to set yourself up in the position of the scapegoat, and we'll get back to that. I have a picture of like a diagram for that. I don't think I have it in this lecture though. That's why Socrates died. That's why Christ died. Okay, so modernity and the indirect reemergence of the scapegoat mechanism. Well, the scapegoat mechanism has nonetheless, of course, Christian civilization didn't get rid of it, the people, but it mitigated it. It provided the antidote model. And when you do that, that's going to work to a degree. Okay, so they had a whole, there's a whole steady stream of saints they produced over the whole medieval period. from, let's say, from roughly 500 to 1500. You say that that's the Renaissance. I'm not going to draw those distinctions. It's from 500 to 1500. And there were a whole bunch after that too, by the way. Okay, and generally speaking, medieval warfare was, on the whole, rather mild in comparison with what we're going to encounter beginning in the modern period, like a 30 years war and so on and so forth. Okay, relatively speaking. Hold on, my other computer here is singing to me. And people always talk about the Inquisition and all the people they killed. Yeah, there were a lot of bad things happened during the Inquisition. At most, over several centuries, they killed 10,000 people. Okay, so that was not like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide or the Cambodian genocide or the Holodomor, where Stalin killed at least 2 million Ukrainians, or the Gulag or anything of that sort. Still pretty bad. I mean, those persons ought not to have. I'm sure there was a criminal in there somewhere, but you can say the majority of those persons ought not to have died through an auto da fe, for being burned alive. Okay, so granted that the medieval period had its own warts, the modern period begins with the Enlightenment rejection of the Christian substitution of God's sacrifice for the sacrifice of the arbitrary victim. So the modern period basically rejects the Christian rejection of the scapegoat mechanism. So what do? They just bring it back? Well, it's a little bit more complicated. So let me see here. So this is rooted, that their rejection, think about this. Now, who do I think? We even have examples in this course. Now, you didn't study Niccolo Machiavelli. He'd be the first person to think of. Thomas Hobbes, clearly. John Locke, he's more complicated. He's tries to pass himself off as a kind of Christian. Benedict Spinoza, that'd be another one. Rene Descartes, all these figures. David Hume, even Immanuel Kant in his own way. Okay. So this rejection is rooted in mimetic conflict with divine sovereignty. That's what it's rooted in. See that? We're not going to obey God. We find his plan unreasonable. First of all, he's demanding too much of us, right? We can't be like that. I'm not ready to climb up on a crucifix for the sake of my brother. I might throw myself under a train for my son or my daughter, but I'm not going to do this for humankind. It's taken 1,500 years, and Christ has not returned, right? And there's been all sorts of misfortune. Society is suffering general disarray and disorder. By the way, all that's predicted by Christian theologians. They maintain that you'll never have a perfectly well-ordered society here. You have to await the coming of Christ. Okay, it can be relatively ordered at best, right? So with this, due to this conflict, this mimetic imitation of, if you like, God's desire for sovereignty, to put it that way, right? They reject that divine sovereignty. Okay. Okay. So that means they give up on another type of mimetic desire. The one they give up on is mimetic desire for the imitation of divine love. You guys get that? So in a certain sense, God desires his own sovereignty infallibly because he gets it, right? And he desires his own love because also infallibly because he gets that too. And you can enter into rivalry with God for his sovereignty, in which case you reject him and you assert your own will. Or you can enter into rivalry with God for his love. He wants you to do that because if you do that, then you become as progressively as self-giving as he is, right? You say, well, you can't ever be as self-giving as he is. Well, you can eventually, if Christianity is true, you can get to the point where you do embody perfect charity, but that would be through your cooperating with divine grace. Okay, there are theological niceties there that are above our pay grade of this ethics course. So these two types of mutually opposed and irreconcilable mimesis divide our population into distinct camps. Some people are existing in rivalry with the divine sovereignty, which they reject. Other persons are, as it were, they've entered into a kind of healthy rivalry with divine love. They're trying to become more and more morally perfect, at least within that, within this history. That's what it is. We are historical animals, guys. Right? So the Enlightenment rejected divine sovereignty and divine love with the same gesture, in the same gesture. Having rejected the principle of Christian social order, right? What do you do now? They of necessity had to seek replacement mechanisms for securing social peace, right? So how are they going to secure peace now that they've gotten rid of the first principle of social order? Okay, well, they come up with some purely human mechanisms. Here they are. Human reason exercising itself as political philosophy, as procedural justice in the actual existing state, right? In the form of a competitive economy where each person is thrown back on his or her own resources, to quote what I said about Hegel. Each person is thrown back on his or her own resources for satisfying basic needs and satisfying desires, okay? And in the technological domination of nature. So those things right there, right? The newly conceived modern state understood effectively as a mechanism, setting its members in an ideal relation to one another so that each can pursue his or her own interests, right? Such wise that no one, or at least ideally, no one has any particular right to tread upon and negate the rights and interests of others, okay? And this modern political philosophy in several variants is a mechanistic philosophy. It thinks of society as a vast machine with interlocking parts interacting with one another. That's how the founders of the United States of America thought of our government, okay? And as far as justice, well, we're not going to try to kill a scapegoat. We're going to stop judging in our own cause, and we're going to defer to the state and the judges, appointed judges, who will arrive at a neutral verdict or decision concerning a dispute. We'll set up a competitive economy, so each one of us can pursue our interests, and then the whole thing is going to be enhanced by the increasing domination of nature from which all will benefit. That's the basic idea that we saw with C.S. Lewis. Doesn't work out that way. Okay, anyway, procedural justice, economic competition, and technology have proved to offer a fertile bed. Look at this, for the reemergence of mimetic violence. How'd that happen? This has been particularly evident at the level of relations between groups, classes, races, ethnicities, and creeds. The key here is the fading of Christian universality. The idea that we belong to one Christendom doesn't make any difference if you're French or Spanish or Italian or English, whatever it may be. Today, African, Chinese, doesn't make any difference. The fading of Christian universality opened a space for the growth of class, race, national, and religious consciousness, okay? I can go further than that. When you set up a competitive economy, you're setting up a society based on the concept of individual property rights and the right to act on one's conscience. Those two things particularly. You guys get that? So when people have individual interests and individual rights, when the basic unit of society is the individual with his or her interests and his or her rights, you get that? They're in competition with one another, but then that, as it were, reinscribes mimetic conflict right into the heart of society. You follow? Because it's competitive. That's the end of that. That's the end of that. And now various classes, since the very basis, the basic units of society, the individual, are in competition with one another. All subsequent bodies, all higher order bodies, groupings, they're likewise in competition with one another. So classes are in competition with one another, races are in competition with one another, ethnicities are in competition with one another, and creeds are in competition with one another. You follow? And so this leads to the growth of resentment, envy, and mistrust. Okay. So I'll have to rewrite this paragraph here. So there's increased competition. It's even encouraged, competition between individuals and between groups. That's inevitable. Hence, we witness the reemergence of the institution of the scapegoat within late modern and postmodern human societies in relations between groups, and I add individuals. Now, this has certain chilling implications, which we're going to examine. How am I doing for time here? I'm doing that. Not half bad. Actually, better than I expected. Now, let's talk about Giorgio Agamben on sovereignty. I hope you enjoyed that video, the longest of the ones that we looked at. Let me get a sip of this coffee here. Now, when sovereignty appears within a ruling class, that has rejected divine sovereignty, it operates on its own. Say it again. When sovereignty appears within a ruling class, think about the ruling class. Who's the ruling class of the United States of America? It's about 100,000 people. Okay? A large number of them are centered in Washington, D.C. There's a whole chunk of them over in Silicon Valley, and they're spread around the country in various corporate flagship buildings and so on and so forth. Okay? And the various chapters of the Federal Reserve, the 12 chapters of the Federal Reserve and other major banks. These are the people who rule the country. Okay? And I think the majority of them we say are not elected officials. Most of them are, in Fortune 500 companies, the top banks, and they're political appointees, people who are not voted into office, but they occupy some position in an alphabet agency. And NGOs play an important role too. Okay. So that's your ruling class. All right. So that ruling class itself asserts sovereignty over the rest of the country. But that means, guys, that this ruling class, follow Agamben now, determines its own limits without recourse to an external standard, because we're in the modern state now, right? And the modern state is the secular state. It's the state that does not base its authority or its legitimacy on a divine dispensation or divine blessing, divine act. It's a human institution. You guys follow me? It conceives of itself as a purely human institution. It doesn't make any difference if many of the people in it think of themselves as religious. The institution is not religious and defined as not religious. Do you guys follow me? So this ruling class has a kind of, if you like, a hyphenated subject, back to that concept. Bob hyphen Jill hyphen Rick hyphen so on and so forth. This determines its own limits without recourse to an external standard, whether natural or divine. It doesn't appeal to natural law, and it does not appeal to divine law. Okay, the people sometimes mention natural law, and they try to make natural law effective. Martin Luther King did, right? No surprise, he was a Christian who studied St. Thomas Aquinas. As a matter of fact, the operation of the modern state, you can say, you want to push it, you can say that the operation of the modern state exists in operation, it exists in opposition to all positive philosophies of natural law. Okay. Now, some of you are saying, well, Dr. Girard, that doesn't work because you're the one who taught me about Hegel and his theory of the state. And he seems to be more or less successful at, arriving at some kind of positive conception of the modern state that's upholds natural law. Okay, so but that's why I taught you Hegel, because he might escape this logic, and he tried. I think he understood himself as trying to escape this this consequence. But I'm sorry to say, Hegel's theory didn't take. Right? People didn't really imitate Hegel. They tried in Italy under Benito Mussolini. That obviously didn't work out. And there are approximations to it, perhaps in Switzerland and in Norway, but only partial, and leave it at that. It hasn't been a general solution. So Giorgio Agamben describes this situation with precision. Here, sovereignty assumes a peculiar relationship to the law. He observes that we normally think of A, the law, and B, its application as distinct from one another, right? Two different things. In the modern state, however, the two blend in the act of the sovereign. Instead of distinction, we have the law as applied through an act of the sovereign. I could have added here, in the state of exception, or the state of the exception. The sovereign continuously is determining the law in its application in a state of exception, which itself becomes the new norm. Think about what happened after September 11th. A lot of you were too young to remember. That became the state of exception, was then justified instituting the surveillance state, which is what we have right now. And then Ed Snowden blew the lid on that in 2014, and for some reason, Obama's supporters continued to support him, even despite his energetic defense of the surveillance state. And Think of COVID, and under COVID, we suffered lockdowns and enforced facial masks and social distancing, and that was the least of it. There was a vaccine mandate. They forced that on everyone. And that was illegal too. That was illegal. You can't mandate that persons participate in a medical experiment. You simply can't do it. And if something's emergency use authorization, that makes it an experimental drug. That's why it gets emergency use authorization. Only experimental drugs require that, right? So you can't require that someone participate in such a thing, yet that became the state of exception, and the sovereign imposed his rule, and that was that. Most of the country went along with it, and particularly the power structure which imposed it on everyone. All right. So to this day, people contest the constitutionality of mass surveillance. They contest many things that they regard as being exercised in violation of the U.S. Constitution. It's a very, very most common claim ever I hear amongst a certain class of commentator that the Constitution exists merely on paper today. I mean, they defend it when they want to, and they don't defend it when they don't want to. Meaning that Agamben is right, that the law exists as law is applied through an act of the sovereign. They just determine sort of ad hoc with respect to this or that circumstance when the U.S. Constitution is going to apply and when it's not going to apply. Okay, for going further back, when the U.S. president issues orders that effectively activate hostilities with a foreign country, he places us in a state of war. Well, that's happened several times, okay, without any declaration of war on the part, famously with Vietnam, right? Without any declaration of war on the part of Congress. And some persons say, well, that's just plainly unconstitutional, right? I think it's in the 4th article. You can have a look, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole list of people go on and on about this. You can even look on YouTube. Look up, U.S. Constitution violations on YouTube. You get a whole series of lectures on it. Okay, so there was literally no external standard by which a modern sovereign is to determine some of his acts as just, others as unjust. And you might emphasize there's no standard that the individual even tries to access psychologically, right? I mean, if you have a sovereign like Pius Louis IX or something of that sort, who has a healthy fear of hell, father confessor, prays 3 or 4 hours a day, so on and so forth, and reads scripture, knows it, and it really is, for all of his faults, right? It really is trying to live by the 10 Commandments and the Beatitudes, and the Sermon on the Mount, generally speaking, right? The prompting, what he takes to be the promptings of the Holy Spirit. That's a completely different type of sovereign, okay, relative to Bismarck, all right, or either Teddy Roosevelt or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay, Calvin Coolidge is the big one. So the standard is created in the act of applying it. That's the key. That's Agamben's observation. I mean, I'm putting it rather bluntly, but I believe that's consistent with what Agamben says. He usually writes in such a subtle and elusive way that his text becomes almost unteachable for undergraduates. So I'm trying to put it in a more straightforward way. So this applies most visibly in the case where the sovereign engages in acts depriving others of property and life. Okay, it's when the sovereign starts killing people, guys. Okay, and taking away their property and locking them in black rooms, in prisons around the planet, that the operation of the sovereign is exhibited at its limit. Okay, so this produces a paradox. Here's the paradox, direct from Agamben. See if you can get this. So the fact justifying an act of extra constitutional authority, that fact is absent, right, until it's declared, because it's the sovereign who has the right to declare. He has the right to declare that there's now a fact which justifies my going beyond or to do something which you perceive as me going beyond the Constitution. But actually, it's a perfectly legitimate expression of sovereignty, right? Because the fact has justified it. But that fact, as it were, comes into existence through the act of declaring that it justifies his action. Okay. Now, on the other side, the right to declare it at a time presupposes the fact. I mean, that is the right to declare that fact at a time presupposes the fact. The fact should be there already, right, in order for him to have the right to declare it. So that right itself is absent until we have the fact. So there's a peculiar sort of catch-22 here. You need the fact to justify the right. You need the right in order to bring into existence the fact. What we encounter now is that the fact and the right enter together from nowhere. Okay, so when you read Agamben, his whole book is full of thoughts like those. If that makes you dizzy, don't worry about it. I'm not going to require that you, be some kind of continental sophisticate like Giorgio Agamben. So for Agamben, sovereignty becomes most visible in the concentration camp. Here in the United States, the Native American reservation, which is a concentration camp, obviously concentration camps of World War II under the Nazis, but also here, what we concentrated the Japanese. Today we have Guantanamo Bay, maybe not technically a concentration camp, but still in the same category, right? There's certain sweatshops where one can suggest. Again, the people who own the majority shareholders, okay, and the people who run the Fortune 500 companies, folks, they're part of the ruling class. They rule. You didn't vote them into office, but they exercise such power that they're basically rulers. The rulers is what they are. And they set up these sweatshops. At least they deliberately contract with the persons who own them out in Bangladesh, particularly, where thousands of people have died in them, okay? And possibly the soon to arrive 15-minute city. Now, Donald Trump was calling those freedom cities. It's the same thing. Under Biden, it's the 15-minute city. Under Donald Trump, it's the freedom city. It's the exact same thing. This will be run by AI, by the way, our great emancipator. So if we assemble insights from Debord, now I haven't talked about Debord yet, but I'll get to it. As Girard and Agamben, we can produce the following image on the next slide, which I'll get to. So with Guy Debord, I mispronounced his name, he puts forward the idea of the society of the spectacle. And all we need to know about that right now is that, well, how much time do we spend looking at images? So Debord noticed that we spend an inordinate amount of time looking at images. He noticed this back in 1967. At least that's when the book was published. So he noticed it prior to that, over whatever period of time it took him to write that book. And the long and the short of it is that this vast accumulation of images in one's wetware, in one's brain, replaces reality. So every single relation you have to another human being and to yourself is mediated by an image. And these images, my friends, tend to come from Madison Avenue, from people who craft advertisements designed to manipulate you into identifying happiness with a tube of toothpaste or a car or a dress or whatever it may be. It's all very effective. And it also comes from political propagandists. Okay? Today, it's much more insidious. It's all that stuff I just mentioned. And it's also big tech and their various techniques on social media and through Google searches to manipulate public opinion, belief, and action. And they're very successful at that. Look at, so successful it's actually frightening. They basically control how we think, to be perfectly frank. That research has been done by a Dr. Robert Epstein, E-P-S-T-E-I-N. And you should look up his website, stopbigtechnow.com. So www.stopbigtechnow.com. And just type his name into Google. I don't think they've deleted his videos yet. You can watch them. They seem to be aware of the fact that they have so completely destroyed the intellect and the motivation to think and to assert one's rights and freedom of your average American citizen that doesn't make any difference what a Dr. Robert Epstein says in public anymore. Let him chirp away. It's not going to have any practical effect. We'll see. Maybe it will. So let's assemble all of these insights. What do we end up with? We end up with this rather difficult to decipher picture I put together here. So you have a ruling elite in the middle here. Now, that includes your business class, your Washington elites. Obviously, it includes the DOD, Department of Defense, the State Department, obviously the intelligence agencies, right? And the same parallel structure in every foreign country, at least the powerful ones, the ones that aren't under the boot of the more powerful ones, right? So basically, the West, the United States, the European Union, Russia is powerful enough to stand on its own, and China. and to a degree Japan, South Korea, Singapore. India is growing as we speak. Okay. All right. So this ruling elite, they command a technology for generating images which effectively succeed in manipulating people's emotions, in turn causing them to form the beliefs that the elite want them to have, and to perform the actions they want them to perform, and not perform the actions they don't want them to perform. So I'm being the only way of talking about this is oversimplifying, because what they actually do, I think I could teach a whole course on this. What they actually do is set up an opposite, or a series actually of oppositions within our society. Okay, Republican versus Democrat. They've been trying very, very hard to set up an effective kind of race war. I don't think they really succeeded at that. There's a little flare up over George Floyd a few years ago, but beyond that, not much. I mean, here and there, I'm not ignorant of the news and whatnot, but not really. And particularly if you've worked in a warehouse or worked in trucking, as I have, yeah, guys, there's no race war going on there. There's a lot of backslapping and asking how's the family doing and stuff like that. Okay, so men and women went through both masculinism and feminism. They teach men to treat women as mere sex toys with pornography, so on and so forth, and the women rebel with feminism. What else are they supposed to do if the men are a bunch of baboons? Okay, and so on and so forth. So they set up those oppositions. So through their technology, they produce the spectacle. Okay, so, and this is my account of the spectacle here. It's too brief, but we don't have all the time in the world. Images bearing narrative potentialities, presupposing inverted values. So what are the inverted values? They put forward money and pleasure and power and status as the ends of life. Those can't possibly be the ends of life. It's even self-contradictory to point them, posit them as the ends of life. Means can't be the ends. And as far as physical pleasure, it just appears. It can't be the end. So these images mediate self-consciousness and the consciousness of others. That means when you're conscious of yourself through the mediation of images provided by the ruling elite. So you're hidden from yourself. And of course, you're hidden from others, and others are hidden from you in virtue of these images. So this leads to, well, you can call this a kind of materialization of our society. What do I mean by that? We end up pursuing material values. That's all I mean. Those inverted values of power, money, reputation, and status. Now, the difficulty is that we then rationalize the pursuit of those values, right? Remember the discovery of the psychologists? We find sham justifications for making money and power the aim, the be-all, end-all aims of life. Status and pleasure, okay? Now, that leads to the phenomenon of what I call immanentization. That is, persons who are victims of this, and to an extent, everyone's a victim of this, they end up relying upon an immanent set of representations which close them off from the divine. They don't look up towards the true, the good, the beautiful. You can be a Platonist, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Taoist. All these different traditions have a Christian, right? Obviously, all these different traditions have a conception of the divine. They look up. Right? There's an infinite heights to which they aspire, whereas the spectacle lowers the ceiling. It has a ceiling to begin with. It lowers that ceiling and makes you running around looking for, a nice looking pair of high tops. Listen, some of those high tops are perfectly fine. I'm not against wearing high tops, but if you look upon a pair of high tops as the be all end all, as the source of joy, that you're a victim of the spectacle, guys. Okay, someone's going to get angry at me for saying that. Okay, so that leads to that immanentization and closure upon the self. And that destroys our society. It atomizes our society, a group of individuals seeking their own satisfaction in the form of high tops or a tube of toothpaste or a hamburger, or whatever it may be. None of those things can provide satisfaction. The only things that can are moral virtue, community, meaning, love, wisdom, and so on, okay? And a relationship with your creator. Now, in a metaphysics course or introduction to philosophy course, we spend more time talking about proofs arguments for and against the existence of God. Okay, but that's we get a little bit of that here. We can't do too much. So that excludes the transcendent, and it involves a kind of endless self-praise on the part of the ruling elite. How wonderful we are. Okay. Okay. So the spectacle directs this self-praise or directs this praise rather, in certain very definite directions. These are calculated. The ruling elite praises itself, right? So now your goal in life, and it's set for you by the ruling elite, is to be a billionaire. You're not going to become a billionaire, but that's your goal anyway. And if you don't become a billionaire, you're a failure. Okay? And if you don't become a billionaire, you should be thankful from the bottom of your heart for having a job provided to you by a billionaire, and be paying taxes into the system which functions mainly for the billionaires. Okay? So that's one way the spectacle works. And you're not allowed to criticize it either. If you do, that makes you, socialist or a communist, and basically a complainer and a whiner and a loser. So you don't want to be a complainer, whiner, loser. You want to praise billionaires and work for them. Okay, the second thing they have you praising is science, or the science technology juggernaut, a kind of idol god. Okay, that I say an idol god because they treat it as a god. It's infallible. Under COVID, everything they told us was infallible. Turns out everything they said was false. Masks don't help. Social distancing makes things worse. Sheltering in place made things worse, or at least according to the numbers we have. They produced some sham studies trying to show us that the mRNA pseudo vaccine was beneficial. That was a lie. Okay, and they knew in advance it wasn't going to prevent transmission. They said hundreds of times it would prevent transmission. They actually lied about that. So much for infallibility. The science technology idol god is a source of lies, and it lies incessantly. It lies incessantly. Okay. Anyway, no matter, who cares? It's sovereign, because it's aligned with the ruling elite. They own it. Okay. It's all powerful, self-legitimating. It's an idol god. That's what it is. And they also treat the state this way. The state has this supreme and exclusive authority within its given territory, and it's the United States of America over the entire world. Okay, unless you can hold them off, as China sort of does, right? China sort of does. Okay, so what do you have? You have your business class. You have your science technology, juggernaut. You have the state as your three sovereign powers that ultimately cohere into one secular trinity of sovereignty. All right, all supported by the spectacle. If you criticize any of that, you're a kook. Well, you're a whiner, you're a complainer, or you're a kook. And if you complain about the ruling class saying they're controlling everything, you're a conspiracy theorist. Now you're a whining, complaining conspiracy theorist kook, and anti-science and anti-vax too. You point out that the mRNA thing didn't work, that makes you anti-vax, and you're excluded from polite society. And obviously I'm halfway engaging in a comedy routine here, but it's not even ultimately perfectly entertaining, because it's true. What I'm saying is simply true. All right. So the spectacle also necessarily, thanks to the operation of sovereignty exercised by the ruling class, and remember, the ruling class includes the corporations, and remember that Ford Motors, okay, and the Associated Press and international business machines, IBM, all were vigorous supporters of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany couldn't have moved a millimeter without AP propaganda helping them vilify the Jewish people, at least, and IBM helping them run the information system, which enabled them to collect Jews and murder them. Not to mention Romani and everyone else they killed in those camps and through other means. And Ford, by providing them with ball bearings and other implements, which enabled them to build their tanks and trucks and so on and so forth. Okay, so this ruling elite generate the spectacle. Okay, this involves their exercise of sovereignty, and this is expressed at the limit in the act of killing. And this act of killing is directed towards what Agamben calls bare life. Okay? What's bare life? That's a subclass excluded from legal protections, yet foundational to the entire social order. Now, I'm quoting somebody here. I didn't put his name in here. It says what? I'm not plagiarized. This is from, I forgot to put his name in. I don't remember his name. Okay, these are somebody else. I'm pretty sure these are somebody else's words. This refers to a subclass excluded from legal protections, yet foundational to the entire social order, bare life. Now, for Agamben, bare life refers to individuals who are neither murdered nor sacrificed, at least from the standpoint of the sovereign, ruling elite. You guys follow? They're neither murdered nor sacrificed. It's almost like you're stepping on a bug or something of that sort. Now, for Girard, right, the scapegoat is definitely a sacrifice. Now, what I want to suggest is that what's treated as bare life, people always flip on it, look at it from another point of view, and that person becomes the scapegoat. So whereas Jews during World War II, no one wanted to help them. Everybody was cooperating and getting rid of them. When they petitioned, to come over here to the U.S., FDR said, go away, we don't want you, right? So on and so forth. The Romanians had their own little private sort of slaughter of Jews there, so did the Croatians. No help from the Nazis whatsoever. They kind of grabbed the opportunity. Everyone was treating them as bare life, right? Now, Holocaust is officially the most evil thing that's ever happened historically, right? Okay, I mean, it clearly was something of a mind-numbing horror. Huh? And now the Jewish people, they've become the scapegoat. Interesting. You can go from bare life to being the scapegoat. So anti-black racism, they can be treated as a kind of effective scapegoat. There doesn't have to be any killing going on. You just kind of take the group and you put them in a category there, and you find solidarity with other persons who hate them, or whites. People out there, there's a lot of self-hating whites out there. It's a very peculiar application of the scapegoating mechanism. And so they separate some whites to hate from themselves. And I think it's basically Trump supporters, right? Who are supposedly Nazis. By the way, Donald Trump was given the crown of Jerusalem by 162 rabbis in Israel. So they acknowledge him as a friend of the Jewish people. And he spent years studying Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. He said that in one of his autobiographies. I can get the full quote from you. So that the guy, he's no enemy of Judaism, trust me, or of Jews. I think he had 200 Jewish guys from New York on his election committee or something, some incredible number. Okay, so he's friendly to the Jewish population. He's from New York, guys. He's a successful guy from New York. I'm from New York. Half my family is Jewish. Okay, so I have some familiarity with how things are run there, and my family is relatively successful. Okay, so let's see here. How about J6ers? Yeah, try to overthrow our government, right? They're no good. Transgenders. The whole point here is that the scapegoating mechanism frames things such that one takes a particular group of individuals and renders them as the anathema, thus justifying treating them as non-human or even demonic. Okay. All right, guys. So that's that. So now, what unfortunately this leads to historically is the concentration camp. And we've already seen. I gave you a whole list of stuff. The Native American reservation, obvious actual concentration camps that have existed historically, Guantanamo Bay, and that sort of thing. So the concentration camp is the site of scientifically organized torture and experimentation. It's also the site of eugenics. I bet $100 that there's eugenicist experimentation going on in Guantanamo Bay. It's like, you're Dr. Shikiar, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist. But conspiracy theories are doing pretty well, I have to say. The Hunter Biden laptop was supposed to be a big conspiracy. It turns out it's true. It's full of all sorts of crimes and whatnot. He probably got off light with respect to the tax evasion and owning an unregistered gun or whatever it was, whatever they got him on. You got that fellow Tucker Carlson, he's also anathema for a lot of people, but he brings on persons who actually adduce evidence. Now suddenly he acknowledges that on September 11th of 2001, in New York, a third building fell down that was not hit by a plane. And structural engineers and architects will tell you that's impossible. It's as likely as refrigerator collapsing into itself for no reason, or your automobile, you just look at it, suddenly it collapses into itself. It was as flat as a pancake right in front of you. It's not going to happen. So in order to account for that third building, called Building 7, on September 11th of 2001 going down, you have to acknowledge what had to have been the case, had to have been wired in advance. So somebody knew that September 11th of 2001 was going to be a very special day, and they wired that particular building to go down. Okay? Because they knew the other two big ones were going to go down. So how did they know that? Okay, you follow? And I could say some other stuff that'll get me in trouble, so I'm just going to leave that alone. You want to find out about that. There's a guy named James Corbett, C-O-R-B-E-T-T. You go to the CorbettReport.com. And he has a whole series of what do you call it? Documentaries on 9/11, and he pokes, he pokes 999 holes in the official story. Okay, that's basically a dead story at this point. All right. By the way, eugenics is turning into transhumanism, and transhumanism is the endeavor. Now, we've already studied transhumanism, right, with C.S. Lewis. That's the endeavor to destroy our species, right? So this ruling elite, through science and technology, are experimenting on our population, okay, with a view towards creating the transhuman. Now, they themselves want to become transhuman, right? So apparently they want to set up various levels of transhumanism. They'll be the super duper transhumans, and they'll probably make us, if they allow us to live, and if they succeed at this, I don't think this will happen, but in their fevered imaginations, they would make you and me into a lower level transhumans, use us for something or other, right? Maybe reduce the population a bit. That's one of the difficulties of this thing. I think I mentioned last time, the persons who want to sort of set up some kind of AI society and have all of our, have your toaster and your vacuum cleaner and your refrigerator communicating with one another, and you communicating with some satellite somewhere because you've been injected with something that has that kind of electromagnetic potentiality. That takes an incredible amount of energy, right? And so they can't really get that done with the current level of energy outputs. So they have to do two things. The population has to go down. That's number one. So one way of doing that is by encouraging people to use contraception. Second way is by putting sterilizing agents in our food and medication. And that would explain, if you go into OpenAI right now and ask them how many women between the ages of 30 and 35 are experiencing menopausal symptoms, it'll tell you half. Go do it right now. And then when you're done with that, ask OpenAI or ChatGPT, whatever they call it, how many women between 35 and 40 are experiencing menopausal symptoms, say in the US. Turn out that's 2/3. How'd that happen? And then ask them what is the average male sperm count today relative to the year 2000 or the year 1990. It's roughly half. Okay, how'd that happen? How'd that happen? So suddenly the reproductive capacity of our species has gone down dramatically. And since I'm getting myself in a lot of trouble today, I'll just relate the facts to you. A fellow named Aaron Siri, he's I won't be able to post this one on YouTube. The fellow named Aaron Siri, he got a judge to require that Pfizer publish their internal documents on the contraindications and safety facts of their mRNA COVID potion. I refuse to call it a vaccine because they have changed the definition of vaccine to call it that. That was for the liability shield, by the way. And so once they published that, 3,250 scientists descended on that. And they combed through it. They're all virologists and epidemiologists, so they're competent people. And they published a book. Have I mentioned this already? I can't remember. It's called the Pfizer Papers. So you want to check that out. And they claim to show, boy, I don't want to upset anybody, but this is what they claim. They claim to show that pseudo vaccine is a sterilization agent, amongst other things. It causes all sorts of problems, but it's basically a sterilization agent. Okay, so one can conclude that the ruling elite generating the spectacle, setting up science technology as a god, themselves the billionaire as a kind of saint of sorts, want to be, and the state as a source of unquestionable authority, right? they have now defined themselves against a class of individuals whom they treat as bare life, right? Occasionally making their operation visible in the case of a concentration camp. Only the difficulty is that under COVID, the entire world became the concentration camp. And that is a conclusion drawn by Giorgio Agamben himself. When he did that, he was ejected from polite academic, liberal academic circles. You can't say that sort of thing because those persons are brainwashed. They also worship the science, technology, idol god. Pardon, I'm speaking very frankly today. Boy, I'm getting myself in real trouble. So you don't have to agree with me, okay? So this ruling elite here, you can just I'm a conspiracy theorist, just write me off, okay? This ruling elite here turned the entire world into a concentration camp for the purpose of, well, they were torturing people, clearly, letting the elderly die, a very large number of them die alone, not surrounded by their loved ones, and suffocating. Oh, by the way, 75, according to a study at Northwestern University, they looked at 543 COVID deaths, and examining the death certificates and the autopsy reports, they concluded 75% of those people were killed by the ventilator, not by COVID. Okay. We also know that when they argued that ivermectin does not cure COVID, that was a lie. The studies generating that conclusion were scientific fraud. And don't agree with me simply because I say that. Look up the account of this in The Real Anthony Fauci. There's a whole chapter on it. You tell me if you disagree with me, send me an email and I'll, you give me a good argument. I'm a man of argument and evidence. I'll change my mind on that. But that was a pretty convincing account. They got rid of the ivermectin, and prior to that, hydroxychloroquine. That trial was completely fabricated too, or at least it was forced. Basically, they fed toxic doses of hydroxychloroquine to people who were about to die and then said it was toxic. So, excellent way to do a study. Once they got rid of the actual cures for COVID, they said, oh, it's an emergency. So now we have to introduce an emergency use authorization for this useless so-called pseudo-vaccine, which actually doesn't stop transmission and is actually a sterilization agent. Guys, okay, you have to wake up sooner or later. Oh, I'm a conspiracy theorist, 2 words, conspiracy theorist, and that dismisses an entire theory. And you belong to sane, polite society so long as you can keep up dismissing the sequence of obvious facts. Oh, not only that, they pumped up the numbers of COVID deaths by sending persons who are sick back into nursing homes when you know that they knew it was going to spread around, and then killing them with ventilators. And the whole ventilator problem was predicted by Dr. Kyle Seidel, who was running the ICU at Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn, and that was dedicated to the worst COVID patients. He said, this is not actually a respiratory illness, guys. It looks more like flight sickness or something, something like that, like altitude sickness of some sort. And the ventilators are going to hurt these people. That's what he said. He was being very polite. He didn't say that it's going to kill them, but that's obviously what you can infer, right? Because if you hurt somebody past a certain degree, it becomes death. All right, so much for that cheerful lecture. And I'm actually optimistic about the future. And you'll be surprised for me to hear that. I'm actually optimistic about the future because I meet so many good people who are quite aware of everything I just said and are not dominated by the spectacle, and who have goodwill and do love truth, goodness, and beauty above power, pleasure, reputation, status, and things of that sort. By the way, those aren't bad things. You need money in order to, let's say you like your church or your synagogue or whatever. Well, you need money to run the place. I mean, so money is instrumentally good, and you have to control your environment to a certain extent. So you want some degree of power, right? And having people, having relationships of love and mutual support are good. So having some kind of status, positive status, is good. What was the other one? Pleasure. There's nothing wrong with eating a good muffin, right? My wife made me a lemon bar today, absolutely delicious. It's amongst the best desserts I've ever had in my life. These are all good things, guys, but they're lower than truth, goodness, beauty, moral virtue, okay, friendship, love, and holiness. Those things are above those things. You have to have the right rank ordering or values, otherwise you end up with inversion, and all this bad stuff happens over here. I'll go over it again. All right, guys, so hopefully that helps give you a picture. Again, you're not required to agree with me. Some of my more controversial statements, they're just, just think about them. Let's see here. What happened? I shared the screen and then it disappeared on me. Okay. Well, I just recorded that whole thing. I can't do it again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you guys the, I'll send you the slides and you'll have to go through them as I'm reading them. Okay. That's how it has to be. All right. Be well.